Hello, and thank you for joining us today. The GCLS virtual series is welcoming you to the presentation, Writing Diverse Characters, a Practical Guide to Writing Outside of Your Sphere. This panel is sponsored by Lynn Ames.
Hi, I'm Lynn Ames. I'm proud to sponsor this GCLS virtual event on writing diverse characters, and I'm even prouder of you all for being here. It's challenging to get outside your comfort zone. It's challenging to take a risk, and it is a risk, let's face it, to write outside yourself. Will people think I'm appropriating a culture that isn't my own? Will people believe me? Can I be authentic in doing this? Or will it seem like I'm just taking advantage of a moment? This is the first step, being here today for this particular event. So congratulations for being here. I'm proud of you. Writing diverse characters is so important. You know, we can all stay in our little lanes, in our little boxes, and that's safe and it's fine, but it's not what the world needs right now. It's not what our community needs right now. Now's the time to broaden outside ourselves, and let's all learn it together. So thank you to the GCLS for putting on this important event, and thank you to all of you for attending. I'm a proud sponsor of this event. See you soon. Bye.
Thanks again to Lynn Ames for sponsoring this presentation. Please remember the GCLS Code of Conduct, which you can read more about in the chat and on the GCLS website. Also, we'd like to thank you for your continued support of our virtual series and of the GCLS in general. Donations are always welcomed and greatly appreciated. Donations can be made throughout the event and after. And if you're watching this as a recording, you can make that donation at donorbox.org/GCLS-VS. These donations are used to cover the technical costs of the virtual series so we can continue to bring you exciting sessions with relevant content. No donation is too small. So let's get started. We hope that you enjoy this event. I'd like to turn over this session to our moderator, Tagan Shepard.
Thanks so much, Susie, and thank you again, Lynn, for sponsoring today's presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. All right. Hi, everyone. FYI, this class is about writing diverse characters, not making PowerPoint presentations, because I'm not really good at the latter, so sorry about that. Anyway, I'm so happy to be here with you today to talk about writing diverse characters with thoughtfulness and care. I'm intending this course to be a practical guide to writing outside your sphere, so I have a lot of information to impart. I do want to warn you that this class is a little dense, and I have no doubt you'll have questions. There will be time at the end for questions, so take note of them, put them in the Q&A box, and we'll discuss them, okay? And I want to say up front, this will probably not be a comfortable class for all of you. A lot of what we're talking about is confronting your unconscious biases so you can be thoughtful when you write. You may see reflections of some of your characters in the list of stereotypes, and you'll probably feel defensive if you do. Believe me, I know the feeling. A lot of what I'm sharing are things I've learned by doing it wrong and being called out by my sensitivity readers, editors, and reviewers. It stings, and it can make you want to turn away from writing diverse characters in the future. The important thing to remember is that learning, growing, and confronting our own biases make us stronger people and better writers. So if this class makes you uncomfortable, I encourage you to take it as a challenge. Don't stick your head in the sand, but be thoughtful and grow. So a little bit about me. My name is Tagan Shepard. I use she, her pronouns. I've published 7 novels of women-loving women fiction with Bella Books, and my latest novel, Almost Perfect, came out this month with Bold Strokes Books. I'm a graduate of the GCLS Writing Academy, and I'm the former director of diversity and inclusion for GCLS. Probably an obvious question you're asking yourself is, why is a white cisgender lesbian teaching a class on writing diverse characters? It's a valid question. The answer is that I've written quite a few characters who are outside my sphere, so I know how to do the research, how to work with sensitivity readers, and probably most importantly, I've made a lot of mistakes. I've learned from those mistakes so I can help you avoid them. Furthermore, in the DEI world, we talk a lot about emotional labor. In this context, emotional labor refers to the work people of color are compelled to do by others, particularly white people, to keep those white people happy. For instance, when a person is told their comment is racist, They insist a person of color explain how it's racist. Then they argue that their intentions were good, requiring validation and forgiveness. This is asking a marginalized person to do your work for you, and it's not appropriate. Put more simply, it's not the job of a Black person to teach you how to write a Black character, or the job of a neurodivergent person to teach you how to write a neurodivergent character. It's your job to put in the time and emotional energy to ensure your characters are well-developed, authentic individuals. Okay, jumping right in. Thinking about writing diverse characters. That's the point, right? To be thoughtful, to think when you write. Being thoughtful means making sure you aren't just representing a minority group, but you're representing that group well. Good rep is essential because bad rep is harmful. So what does good representation look like? Good representation shows a marginalized character as a fully rounded individual. Their unique cultural experience is highlighted and celebrated without othering them. They have a distinct purpose in the story, and most importantly, the depiction is authentic. What does bad representation look like? Well, bad representation of a marginalized character uses harmful stereotypes or microaggressions. Oftentimes, bad rep has characters who exist only to highlight some trait in the main character who is not from a marginalized group. The character becomes a caricature, a cardboard cutout who is reduced to a plot device. This is problematic for a couple reasons. The first is it's lazy writing, and none of us want to be lazy storytellers. But more importantly, bad representation does actual harm to people. Being in the LGBTQ community, we've certainly all experienced a character on a TV show, movie, or in a book who represented a queer stereotype. I know I have. Watching these characters hurt. The more characters like that who exist, the harder it is for us to gain acceptance, to be seen as who we really are, because for some people, the only queer person they'll ever meet is on screen. This class will give you a roadmap for how to ensure you don't write anything that hurts someone else. It isn't perfect, and it isn't gospel. It's about a mindset, not a rigid set of rules. But there are a few strategies you can use to avoid some of the biggest pitfalls. So in the last slide, I used a few words that might be new to you. Even if they aren't, let's talk through some definitions so we're all on the same page. The most important part of writing diverse characters is making sure you avoid harmful stereotypes and microaggressions. A stereotype is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image of a particular type of person. A microaggression is similar, but tends to be less identifiable as harmful because it's a subtle or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. So these are the biggest concern for us as writers because so many of these stereotypes have been baked into us as readers that they make their way into our writing without conscious thought. And that's why thoughtfulness is key. Othering is treating or viewing another person or group as intrinsically different from oneself. This usually involves a negative view of the other because human nature is to see oneself as good. It's a way of negating someone else's humanity. And this is the feeling one gets when one encounters a negative stereotype about oneself. It isn't a good feeling, and you don't want to give your readers this feeling. It's also important to note the difference between a harmful stereotype and a literary trope, as they're often confused. A trope is a commonly recurring theme, device, or cliche. A stereotype, as I described in the last slide, is also a form of cliche. It's so commonly used that it becomes shorthand. The difference here is that a trope is shorthand for an event or an idea, like the two love interests arrive at a hotel and the last room available has only one bed. We all know where this is going and we enjoy the ride. There's a ton of these, and they can be a helpful avenue for understanding the plot arc for readers. A harmful stereotype is equally commonly used, but rather than being shorthand for an event, it's shorthand for a person. Like the predatory lesbian stereotype that was the hallmark of mainstream media until the 2010s. The main character is generally a sweet, naive straight girl who is pursued by the predatory lesbian until she relents and starts a relationship with her. Then the naive girl meets a nice guy and the lesbian becomes possessive and aggressive until the nice guy finally has to save the naive girl from the evil lesbian. Stereotypes over time become the only depiction of a marginalized group, telling the rest of the world that this is what everyone from that community is like. Then the powerful effect of othering takes over, and now everyone thinks lesbians will stalk their teenage daughters. But no one thinks all hotel rooms have only one bed. That's the power of unconscious bias, and it's what we're fighting when we try to write good representation. So my advice on writing outside your sphere is to start with these 4 steps. Know the stereotypes of the marginalized group you're writing so you can avoid them. Do research to ensure your representation is authentic. Interview someone inside that group for their perspective, and use a sensitivity reader. A large part of this class will be education on some of the most prevalent stereotypes and microaggressions in literature and entertainment. This will not be an exhaustive list, so you should seek out resources of your own based on your needs. I'll give you tips on where to look for those later. You should also learn as much as you can about the culture of the people you're writing. As queer people, we can all remember a character we've seen or read who was obviously written by a straight person because there was no understanding of queer culture, the shared experience of being queer. There's more to being a lesbian than being a woman who has sex with women, but oftentimes that's how we're depicted in stories written by someone who isn't queer. It's the reason we talk so much about the male gaze in mainstream sapphic entertainment. The same goes for any marginalized group. And you can't learn about cultural nuance from resources written by folks outside that group. So don't go to books written by white people to learn about Latinx culture. Go to books written by Latinx authors. Watch shows run by Latinx showrunners and with Latinx screenwriters. An even better resource for learning about a culture is from the people inside it. So interview someone with a disability you want to write about, for instance. But I urge caution on this. If your only source for writing a character outside your sphere is an interview and nothing else, you run the risk of writing that one person's experience rather than a depiction of the culture. For instance, if I want to write a bisexual character, I could interview my wife about her experience, but then I only know her experience, not the full breadth of what it means to be bisexual. Communities are not a monolith. Everyone's experience is different. This is especially true when you delve into generational differences within the same identity. I ran into this recently when I was writing a younger character with a differing sexual orientation. A 40-year-old's experience as a bisexual woman is very different from a 20-year-old's experience. Be cautious when selecting your interview for the subject for this reason, or even better, talk to multiple people. And the final step is to use a sensitivity reader. It's impossible to find everything you need to know either through research or an interview. A sensitivity reader can catch problematic content that sneaks in even with all the other work you've done. In writing outside your space, the first step is to determine what harmful stereotypes and microaggressions exist so you can avoid them. This is not a complete list. They're the most obvious and most common negative depictions. This is the place to start your research, not everything you need to know. For the sake of time, because there could honestly be a year-long course on this, I can't cover every minority group here. If you're interested in writing a character with a background I don't cover, feel free to reach out to me or the GCLS Diversity and Inclusion Committee for places to start. Writing racially diverse characters is the thing we most often think of when we speak about writing outside our experience. And that's because it's arguably where the worst representation happens. Let's start with writing Black or African American characters. To start, it's important to note that the use of Black as an identifier for a person should always be capitalized in your manuscript. Things to avoid at all costs, especially if you're a white writer. Writing Black characters with criminal behavior, especially if they're the only ones in the book who break the law. Now, if you're writing a cop drama, there may be some leeway here, but very little. For instance, if your detective is white and all of your criminals are Black, that's not okay. Broken families, absent father, family member in jail. Again, if your book revolves around a support group for folks with incarcerated family members and one of the members is Black, that's okay. If all the members are Black and your protagonist is the only white person, that's not okay. And it's particularly important to avoid white saviorism if you include a Black character. Let's define white saviorism quickly so we understand what we're talking about. White saviorism involves a white person who is depicted as liberating, uplifting, or rescuing racially marginalized characters. It stems from a sense of superiority, that they must swoop in and save BIPOC folks, often implying that they're saving them from themselves or their communities. The movie The Help is a great example, or if you're from my generation and still carry a torch for Michelle Pfeiffer, Dangerous Minds. A Black character who exists only to be saved by the white lead is deeply problematic. The angry Black woman stereotype is another one to avoid. If you have one Black woman in your story and she's always screaming at everyone else who behave perfectly rationally, that's a stereotypical depiction, and there have been way too many of them. Don't add to the list. Dialogue choices arguably show more about your character than anything else, and they are also the places our unconscious biases show most often. Black characters with poor grammar or excessive profanities is a big no-go. Is there a place for African-American vernacular English? Absolutely. Does that mean you should use it in your dialogue if you are not Black or African-American? Probably not. This mostly applies if every other character speaks with perfect grammar and only your Black character uses poor grammar. It usually connects to one of the stereotypes above, right? Characters who grew up poor in a broken home surrounded by gangs wouldn't speak with perfect grammar, right? Well, why is that the background of your character? Especially if they're the only character in the story with that background. Hispanic or Latinx characters have another set of stereotypes to avoid. While Black characters are too often depicted as stealing, Latinx characters are too often depicted as drug dealers. There's a lot of baggage to unpack with the American war on drugs, and the stereotype should just be avoided. Like the angry Black woman, the fiery Latina is a negative stereotype long used to demean Latinx women. Never describe your characters as spicy as a pepper or fiery or have them snap at other characters all the time. Part of this stereotype is showing Latinas as loud and shrill, big personalities, always the life of the party, and promiscuous. Okay, dialogue choices. First of all, not every Latinx person is bilingual. Keep that in mind as you make dialogue choices with these characters. If they are bilingual, it's important to be aware of how bilingual folks use multiple languages. It is very rare for a bilingual person to pepper single words of a second language into their everyday speech. It's far more likely they'll use phrases or sentences from their second language rather than one word. Like when a bilingual character uses a single Spanish word and it's referring to the white characters as gringo, just don't do that, ever. And another word about bilingual characters. In the past, it has been common practice for statements in foreign languages to be italicized in the text. There's a lot of debate about that currently, with many Latinx authors and advocates preferring to avoid italicized Spanish. Italics are often used for emphasis, so it isn't appropriate to put Spanish words in italics in your manuscript because they can be read as changing the emphasis of the word. There's a really funny YouTube video out there about this if you have any interest. But the general argument is that it's othering and it should be avoided. I no longer use italicized Spanish in my books. I made this mistake in one of my 2020 releases, and I asked my publisher not to italicize in the 2021 sequel. I fall on the side of favoring what the majority of a community wants in depictions of themselves, and I recommend you do the same. Asian characters present a unique challenge to overcoming our unconscious biases. Particularly in America, Asian people suffer under the model minority myth. The model minority myth characterizes Asian Americans as polite, law-abiding people who have achieved success through a combination of innate talent and pull yourself up by your bootstraps immigrant work ethic. It seems like a positive opinion, but it's just as harmful as the negative stereotypes we associate with other minorities. It erases individuality, ignores differences in Asian cultures, makes Asian people perpetual foreigners, and erases violence and racial discrimination against Asian people by convincing white people they're successful so they aren't being discriminated against. It's all incredibly wrong and harmful. So if your Asian character is a doctor who graduated early as a valedictorian of their high school despite their meek father and tiger mom, this is not a positive depiction. And again, broken English and dialogue, particularly among the parents' generation or with characters in service industries, should be avoided. We face a unique challenge with identifiers for Native and Indigenous characters in that many of the identifiers we are familiar with are not accurate. For this reason, we have to be exceedingly delicate with our language choices. Native, Indigenous, Native American, and First Nations are all broad identifiers and are in many cases geographically distinct. I would highly recommend you look for resources from the tribes themselves before identifying a character. For instance, the tribal name Sioux, which many of us grew up learning, has largely been rejected by the Lakota and Dakota peoples it references. It's an exonym, which means it was created by someone outside the named group, not members of the group itself. The term moved to English from French, which in turn was a translation from either the Ojibwe word for snake or the Algonquin word for foreigner. So you can see why they might reject that name. Further, there are many Lakota and Dakota tribes, so using just Lakota would rarely be accurate. And so keep in mind, most tribal names we are familiar with are exonyms. I'd also like to take a moment to point out that while some exonyms have been rejected, some are actually slurs. For instance, the Inuit, Yupik, and Native Alaskan peoples were formerly referred to with a racial slur, which I won't use now, but begins with an E. Not only should we be aware not to use this term in reference to people, there are other ways the slur can accidentally find its way into our work. For instance, there was an ice cream bar which used that name up until last year. People commonly refer to two people rubbing their noses together as a kiss with that word. And there is a common reference to someone being so charming they could sell ice to them. None of these phrases should make their way into your work because they literally contain a racial slur. Find any other way to call your character charming than saying they could sell ice to a Native Alaskan. The stereotypes for Indigenous people are similarly pervasive. For instance, there is a sense that Native American tribes are gone, that white people destroyed them entirely. This is not accurate. Indigenous cultures are alive and thriving. It's particularly important to not speak about Native people as though they don't exist, because our government is still, to this day, trying to take ceded land with the argument that the tribes no longer exist. It's the same old land theft, and perpetuating that myth in our work does actual harm to Native Americans fighting to keep their homes. Much like the model minority myth, the noble savage is a racist stereotype that appears at first glance to be somewhat positive. It hinges on the idea that Indigenous people are more attuned with nature and live a simpler life, uncorrupted by the modern world. Think about The Last of the Mohicans or that commercial from the 70s with the supposedly Native man crying to see litter. The problem with this depiction is that it reinforces the idea of white superiority and traps Native people in a perpetual childlike state. It's this view which led to the creation of reservations and boarding schools where Native children were forcibly assimilated, abused, and murdered. Asserting an innate connection to nature also asserts that there is an innate racial difference. Put simply, it's white supremacy. Other stereotypes to avoid would be Indigenous people with alcohol dependency. There's a lot to unpack with alcohol abuse in Native communities, and it's a subject especially white authors should avoid. Similarly, Indigenous women as exotic beauties should be avoided, particularly while Indigenous communities continue to struggle with the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I recognize that I haven't covered all the racial groups here, but time constraints mean I have to move on. I do want to take a moment for an incredibly important topic when writing a racially diverse cast of characters. I have a link here for the Tumblr blog Writing with Color. If you take one single note today, I urge you to write down this web address. Also, if you Google writing skin tone, it will be the first hit. That's because it's one of the most useful and important resources for writing skin tone. They go into a great deal of detail on the page, but I will attempt to summarize. I'm going to start with the biggest thing. Never, under any circumstances, use food words to describe a character's skin tone. Chocolate, caramel, coffee, honey, none of them. The reason is that these depictions have been used for hundreds of years to fetishize and dehumanize women of color. Think about it. What do you do with chocolate? You eat it. You consume it. In the same ways, white women have their skin tone described as marble and pearl. What do you do with those? You treasure them. You cherish them. See the difference there? One is about consuming and dominating. The other is about protecting and worshiping. Even setting aside the obvious differences, speaking about women of color in terms of food indicates that they are consumable, something to be taken and then thrown away. It's particularly harmful to compare Black women to chocolate and coffee, which are commodities that historically drove the slave trade. The depiction of Asian women's eyes as almond-shaped have the same connotation with the added bonus of being factually inaccurate. Asian women, of course, vary greatly in physical characteristics, but almond-shaped eyes are more typical of white people than East Asian people. So don't use food words, but do use words definitely describe your character's skin tone, except don't only describe the skin tone of people of color. Describe the skin tone of your white characters. This is exceedingly rare in fiction, and there is a very specific, very racist reason for that. White is seen as default in Western literature, as normal, and you don't describe normal, you describe the abnormal. I'm sure I don't have to point out why that is wrong. White is not default. White is not normal, making everything else abnormal. Again, it's about othering. Describe the skin tone of every one of your characters, including the white ones. Even if every character in your book is white, make it normal to not have a normal. Again, I point you back to Writing with Color. They have a fantastic menu of words that are wonderful in describing skin tone. Earth words and minerals and woods. They talk about undertones and all sorts of ways to layer those descriptions. Also, use other racial identifiers besides skin tone. It is absolutely okay to simply say a character is Black, as long as you also say when a character is white. Writing with Color has sections on hair and facial features, all sorts of ways to enrich your character's descriptions. It's a playground of language, and you will learn so much from it. So next, we're going to talk about some issues surrounding depictions of sexual orientation. This might sound like something we'd always get right in women-loving women literature, but identifying with one queer identity doesn't mean we know the lived experience of others. Bisexual characters are some of the most maligned of the queer space in mainstream media, so it's essential that we treat our bisexual siblings with great care. Part of that includes an understanding of what bisexuality is. Bisexuality is an attraction to more than one gender. Oftentimes that's seen as men and women, but that isn't necessarily the case. Gender is not two distinct dots for many people. There are more than two options. So your bisexual characters may be attracted to more than just men and women. Also, keep in mind that folks from younger generations tend to have less rigid ideas about gender. So the experience of a younger bisexual person may be very different from that of an older bisexual person. The stereotypes to avoid with bisexual characters are that they're promiscuous and or can't make up their mind. That's just not how sexuality works. So thinking of it that way is harmful. Also, the idea that people identify as bisexual as a stepping stone before coming out as gay or lesbian is super problematic. Also, cheating, particularly a bisexual woman cheating on a lesbian with a man. This includes a lesbian character who won't commit to her current love interest because a bisexual woman she loved in the past cheated on her with a man. Then the conversation with the love interest reveals that it happened to her too, or the main character says she should have known better than to date a bisexual woman, that she should have expected it. I'll be honest here, there is nothing I feel more strongly about than this one. It's personal for me. My wife is bisexual, and I have to watch the woman I love wilt next to me on the couch every time this plays out on the screen or on the page. And it's not just mainstream media. It's a massive problem in women-loving women fiction. In fact, every example of the cheating plotline I used a minute ago were from WLW romances I've read. These depictions do real, measurable harm to the women we love. Please do not include this in your work for any reason. Okay, I'll step down off my soapbox now. Moving on to gender identity. Transgender characters have been vilified as much, if not more, than bisexual characters in mainstream media. So it's essential that we, as queer writers, don't make those same mistakes. Beyond the sphere of entertainment, transgender people face violence and discrimination in the real world every day. Don't be the person who makes fiction an unsafe space for them as well. The major things to avoid: tricking love interests or hiding their gender identity to get sex from unsuspecting victims. I might also say it would be best to avoid any plot points that involve tricking, hiding, or faking anything where it comes to trans characters. It's a trigger, and it's not something that trans readers should have to see. In introducing your character or expanding their backstory, never ever reveal that they're trans by dead naming or misgendering them. Don't do a flashback to where they were presenting outside their affirmed gender. Don't have a family member arrive to misgender them. I don't want to know your character's dead name. It's a lazy way to reveal your character's gender identity, and it's harmful to trans readers. And it's not necessary. They can literally just say they're trans. The other two to avoid are the trans character as the murderer who gets away with it by executing the crime dressed to reflect their gender assigned at birth, or just a mentally unstable killer. It's been done far too often, so don't add to the list. And the last thing is making the trans character the butt of the joke. Sitcoms and Ace Ventura have that covered, and it's terrible. If you haven't seen the documentary Disclosure, I highly recommend it. You'll be able to see firsthand the pain of trans people who have endured these stereotypes for far too long. While living with a physical disability and living with a chronic illness are two very different experiences, a lot of stereotypes and harmful tropes apply to both communities, so I'm presenting this list as it applies to both. The physically disabled or chronically ill character as inspiration for an able-bodied main character. So this is problematic because it erases the disabled or ill character to a plot device. This is unfortunately very common in news media and nonfiction as well. Like the Tammy Duckworth can do all that without legs, what's your excuse? Senator Duckworth doesn't exist to inspire you to meet your word count for the day. Your character shouldn't do that either. The next one is the chronically ill or disabled character searching for a cure, usually at the expense of their physical or mental health. Disability is not something to be cured. It's not something wrong that has to be fixed. And while we think of illness as something that should be cured, most chronic illnesses can only be managed. And the cure in these cases are treated like the only course to happiness for the disabled character. That implies that these characters aren't or can't already be happy, and that is both wrong and harmful. That leads into the overcoming the disability trope, which is closely linked to the trope of the disabled or chronically ill character being socially isolated and needing the main character to befriend them to pull them out of it. Usually after that inspiring event or new friendship, a character suddenly overcomes their physical limitations or depression. It goes back to the idea that these characters need to be cured or fixed by an able-bodied character who shows them how great life can be. Able-bodied characters as the savior of a disabled character or character living with chronic illness is extremely problematic. First, a definition of neurodiversity so that we're all on the same page. Neurodiversity is a variation in human brain regarding sociability, learning, attention, and mood. Most commonly, this would refer to individuals on the autism spectrum, folks with ADHD, dyslexia, and epilepsy, but there are many different varieties of neurodiversity. Many of the same stereotypes for physical disability and chronic illness apply here, particularly the able-bodied savior and searching for a cure. But there is a very specific, very insidious microaggression I see very often, and I want to warn you against. It's the character who is quirky or cold or super introverted, who doesn't connect well with others, but are neurotypical. And authors will show that the character is neurotypical by saying something along the lines of, they were so weird that they were tested to see if they were on the spectrum, but they weren't, they were just quirky. That statement is actually really gross if you think about it. First, it implies that the only way to experience autism is to be abrupt and not understand social cues. And yes, that can be how some autistic people interact with the world, but not everyone. Folks on the spectrum are not a monolith, and their experiences vary widely. Boiling neurodiversity down to being weird is erasing individuality. It's stereotyping at its most basic level, distilling an entire community down into a single trait. There are better ways of saying your ice queen is a bit of a bitch than saying she's rude but not autistic. Use those ways, not this one. The body size has been used as shorthand for character traits for so long, it's something we rarely notice anymore. Think about pretty much every sitcom since the invention of the television, and you will see fat characters as the butt of the joke. Literature hasn't done any better. Some of the harmful tropes to avoid would be the overweight character, particularly a female character who is sweet but perpetually alone. The only single person in a friend group, but it never dampens her sunny smile and her ability to inspire the main character with a perfect Hollywood body to keep their chin up and go after their dreams. On the other side of that, don't fall into the trap of making your fat characters stupid or ridiculous, the one who makes the rest of the room cringe at a dinner party. I noticed that a lot of books from the 80s and 90s like to use that particular shorthand. It certainly hasn't gone away, but it might be something you grew up reading, so be mindful. And while often we talk about poor representation of body size being characters who are overweight, we need to be mindful of harmful stereotypes of underweight characters as well. Avoid jokes about doing drugs or using disordered eating to stay skinny. They aren't funny and they cause real harm. It's also important to think about how you describe your main characters and love interests. If they always have a perfect Hollywood body and the message you're sending is that only beautiful people deserve to fall in love or be the hero. Okay, so that's me giving you a leg up on your research by listing stereotypes, but there's more work to do. As writers, we're also readers, and I urge you to take advantage of that. Seek out authors of fiction from the marginalized community you want to write about. There's often a voice unique to a community, a cadence like listening to people speak a language you don't know. You can hear the intonations and recognize how they differ from your own language's intonations. If you listen long enough, you can understand the rhythm, even if you don't understand the words. You can achieve a similar understanding by reading the stories of a community. Some people call this own voices literature, the work people inside a marginalized community write about themselves. Similarly, you can learn about the shared triumph and pain through studying the history of a community, the generational intelligence of a people. A word of caution on this, many histories were written by people outside the communities being studied. It's exceptionally difficult, for instance, to find historical information on Indigenous people that isn't written by white people. The oppressor writing the history of the oppressed will not give you a clear narrative. So seek out sources from inside the communities. We're lucky in the 21st century to have access to the thoughts and emotions of people from around the globe, sometimes far more access than we want, but social media is a double-edged sword. It's funny because a week ago, this part of this story was kind of accurate, but now that Twitter's blown up, put a little asterisk by this, but there are fantastic resources on Twitter, especially. My list of stereotypes for physical disability and chronic illness was sourced from a Twitter thread I discovered while researching for a character with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. YouTube is another amazing resource, especially if Twitter catches on fire and, many folks on YouTube make videos specifically to educate. So you tend to get longer, more involved discussions there. Plus there's no length requirement. So it's about dissecting a topic rather than coming up with a great one-liner like on TikTok. And you don't have to navigate long threads like on Twitter. I haven't found as much useful information on Facebook, and I've never really figured out Instagram, but I'm sure there is something to be gained from those platforms as well. When you seek out sources on social media, however, I would remind you to be aware of emotional labor. If you see a thread that gives you information, use it as a starting point for your own research, but be careful about asking the author to answer questions for you. They've already put in the work to create the thread. Don't ask for more. Go to Google from there. And if you know someone from the marginalized community you'd like to write about, great. You have an invaluable resource. Treat them as such. The first step is to understand your relationship with this individual. Are they a good friend, or are they someone who works in the office next to yours and you smile as you pass in the hallway? If you're a friend, go ahead and ask for an interview. If you don't know their name, look for a different source. Again, I refer back to emotional labor. An interview like this is emotional labor, and it's important to understand that going in. It doesn't mean you can't ask. It means you should be aware of what you're asking. When you find someone who you do know well enough, be honest about what you're seeking from this individual. Do they know you're a writer? Tell them. Do they know what kind of questions you want to ask? Tell them. This can give them the full picture, and then they can make a decision based on their comfort level. Part of being honest is giving them a genuine chance to say no. And if they say no, respect that choice. I love to talk about being gay, even the parts that are hard. Some people don't like to have those discussions. I would accept an interview any day of the week. Those other folks who don't feel comfortable talking about an essential piece of their identity, graciously accept their rejection and look for a different source. If they do accept the interview, fantastic. Respect their time and understand they are giving you a gift. Don't show up and expect a 10-hour interview, and don't you dare show up late. If they have to reschedule, accept that change graciously. And part of respecting their time is being prepared. Do the research part before this step. Maybe even outline your story before the interview so you know what you need to know. Don't walk in and say, "Hi, what's it like to be trans?" That question is not answerable. Instead, ask, "What does it feel like to inject testosterone? Were you scared the first time? Tell me about the first time you shaved your new facial hair." Specific questions that can give you the picture you need. Be grateful. Being interviewed about a piece of your identity can feel like being an exhibit in a zoo. It can be uncomfortable. It can be scary. It can be weird even if you didn't expect it to be ahead of time. Understand what you're asking of this person and show, express, and reaffirm your gratitude. Be neutral. If you find out in the interview that a major plot point you had planned revolves around a negative stereotype and now you have to change it, don't get defensive. Don't argue over whether it really is offensive. It sucks that you have to rework your plot, but this person has done you a favor by keeping a stereotype out of your book. Don't be mad, be grateful. And the final thing can be a little tough. Know when to stop the interview because you've asked for emotional labor you haven't earned. This particularly applies if you're white and you're interviewing a person of color. Sometimes an interview will bring up painful memories or experiences that are hard to work out of. This could be because the questions you asked weren't very sensitive. It might have nothing to do with you at all. Either way, discussing lived experience as a person from a marginalized group is emotional labor. Don't ask for more of that labor than your interviewee can give. Did I just copy and paste that last slide onto this one? Yeah, I sure did. The way you work with a sensitivity reader is very similar to the way you work with an interviewee. You're asking for emotional labor, and the favor you're asking for might be painful. Understand your relationship. In this case, your relationship is more clearly transactional. You aren't offering a cup of coffee in exchange for a 2-hour conversation. You're asking for a major time commitment. You need to know if that's too much to ask. Is this person a reader? If they haven't read a book cover to cover since high school, they're probably not the person to ask. If you can't trust that they will be brutally honest with you, they're probably not the person to ask. This includes a partner. Imagine having to tell your partner that the thing they wrote is racist. It would be hard. You might fear you'll damage the relationship forever. If you don't think your partner could do that, don't ask. If you don't think you could hear that from your partner, don't ask. There are resources online where you can find or hire a stranger to read for you. Go that route instead. Be honest about what you're looking for. If you have concerns about a plot point, mention it to your sensitivity reader. If you have concerns about your dialogue choices, mention it to them. Be honest with them so they can be honest with you. Accepting rejection in this case is much the same as accepting it for the interview. Not every person from a marginalized group is interested in being a sensitivity reader. Accept rejection and find another resource. Be respectful of your reader's time. Give them sufficient time to read and comment on your manuscript. For a full-length novel, allow at least a month. Be clear with your expectations. Don't just give them the manuscript and say, give it back to me whenever. Being prepared in this case is clearly outlining their role in the process. Remember that a sensitivity reader is not a beta reader. They are there to tell you about your depiction of a marginalized character. They are not there to give you plot or grammar advice. Tell them what you want them to look for. If they give you advice about the story beyond the scope of their role, be grateful, but don't expect it, even if they're a writer too. Being neutral in this case will be harder than it was for you in an interview. Now we're talking about your manuscript, your baby, and criticism, even constructive criticism, will sting. Remember that the advice of a sensitivity reader is intended to make your manuscript better. It is not an attack on you or your craft. Do your best to create emotional distance between you and your story. Being a sensitivity reader is emotional labor. It can be a significant investment of emotional labor, particularly if you have inadvertently included stereotypes or microaggressions in your story. If your sensitivity reader needs to stop reading for their own mental health, accept that gracefully. Even if you've done everything right, this might happen. It isn't a reflection on either of you. Things just happen. But do not, under any circumstances, argue with a sensitivity reader who needs to step back or speak negatively about them publicly or privately. So there will be times when you want to write a character, but you don't have the ability or resources to take all of these steps. Can you still write that character? Of course. Do as many of the recommended steps as you're capable of doing, and then assess whether you have enough information to continue down your intended path. This will take some thinking and some honest assessment. Ask yourself, can I do this character justice with the information I have? I urge you to be honest in your answer, and I urge you to be skeptical. Find reasons to say no to that question, rather than reasons to say yes. If you can give evidence to refute all those no's, then by all means move ahead. I will advise you, however, to not get in your own way. As artists, we've all had times when we fell in love with an idea and didn't want to give it up. Sometimes that's a good thing. You never complete that first manuscript without following your heart when your head tells you you can't do this. But there are also times when doggedly sticking to an idea gets in the way of telling a good story. If you can't write an authentic reflection of a character from outside your sphere, then write a really good character from inside it. The story will be better if the character is authentic, even if they aren't the character you initially intended. So now you have an idea of how to write diverse characters. The question to ask yourself next is why you're writing diverse characters. Ask yourself why you want a particular character to be outside your sphere. You may have noticed that it's a common theme with minority characters to exist only as an inspiration or props for the main character. If that's your reason, I urge you to rethink your choice. If you've gone through and written all your characters as cis white lesbians, and then you go back and decide which ones you can switch up so you have a more diverse cast, I urge you to rethink your choice. If you put in the time to learn some of the cultural imperatives of these individuals, you'll see that they're too ingrained to write the characters the same way. You can't just slot in a different skin tone or physical ability. That character would approach the world in a different way than a cis white lesbian would. Now, if you're interested in giving a realistic picture of the diverse world in which we live and give an authentic reflection of marginalized characters, please, by all means, go for it. Just go for it thoughtfully. Part of being thoughtful about writing diverse characters is knowing when a story is not yours to tell. There is and always will be debate on this topic. There are no clear-cut rules. One guideline that has more support than others is that it's okay for authors to write a character who is in a marginalized group, but it's less okay to write about being in that marginalized group. Here's an example. Writing the day-to-day life of a trans character versus writing what it's like to be a trans person. Writing about the process of transitioning, what it feels like, the struggles with body dysmorphia, the struggle for self-acceptance. These are experiences unique to a trans person, and you should leave it to a trans person to write those narratives. Part of that is determining your point of view. Writing a trans character in first person versus writing them in third person, even third person close, is a different story. With third person, you are more likely to ride that line of writing a marginalized character. It's hard not to cross that line into writing about being a marginalized character when you're writing from inside their head. And the last piece of advice I'll give you is to remember you're not the only one telling these stories. While we all work toward a more diverse pool of authors in all genres, it's important to uplift the voices of marginalized groups you want to represent. This is the author's note from my book, Queen of Humboldt. Queen has a Latinx main character, so I took a moment to recommend authors who wrote from inside the queer Latinx community. If you include a character from a marginalized group, I highly recommend uplifting voices of authors from inside those groups. If you'll recall from earlier, I recommended reading about authors from the community you're trying to represent, so you should have a book or two to recommend. This is especially important if you're a white writer who can use your place of privilege to support marginalized authors. So that's what I've got for you today. I'm going to open up to questions here in a minute, but first I'd like to offer my sources in case y'all are interested in learning more. I spoke about writing with color, but I also want to mention TV tropes. This is a fantastic resource for harmful stereotypical plot devices. It tends to be geared toward visual media, but can really be a great resource for plot-based stereotypes. And it's also not limited to harmful stereotypes. Also, I've got the best ways to contact me or the GCLS Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Part of the job of the committee is to be a resource for writers and readers. And I may have left the board, but I'm always happy to share my knowledge. Reach out if you have any questions, and feel free to DM me on Twitter if it still exists, if you don't want to send an email. Also, like I said, I follow a lot of advocates for different marginalized communities, and I'll retweet and bookmark those resources they share. I'm always happy to share what I have. Okay, I've talked long enough. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll go through some of the Q&A. The first thing, we got a question in advance, so I want to answer that before I get into the ones that are here. So we had an advanced question about the appropriate rates for being a sensitivity reader. While sometimes you're lucky enough to have someone sensitivity read for you without charge, it is absolutely appropriate to pay, particularly if it's someone you don't know. A really good resource for finding a sensitivity reader or offering your services is writingdiversely.com, and I'm going to add the link to the chat here in a second. But per the Editorial Freelancers Association, the going rates for sensitivity readers are 1 to 2 cents US per word, with a minimum $175 US for any work. Of course, an author wouldn't necessarily have to submit an entire work to a sensitivity reader. They could just submit the chapters they have concerns about with the synopsis for the entire novel. And let me drop this into the chat. Ooh. Everyone, and then I'll get to, okay. All right, Q&A, let's see what we got here. What options do you recommend for finding sensitivity readers? Well, hey, look, I just answered that. Writing Diversely, this is actually what I dropped in the chat is the directory for sensitivity writers. So people will tag what they can answer, read for. It's a pretty extensive list. So that would be where I would start. And then, yeah. Do we know the origin of the term Latinx and how Spanish-speaking people feel about it? That's a great question, Renee, because so Latinx, if you're not familiar with that, Latinx is a term that was especially created by queer Hispanic folks because it takes out the gendered ending. So Latino or Latina has a gendered ending. Latinx is a way to be more inclusive of folks who may not fall into the male-female gender spectrum. And I will tell you that Latinx is not a term that everyone in the Hispanic community has embraced. A lot of folks really do not like it. I would say that you are probably on the safer side if you're talking to a queer Latinx person. That's why I use it. Because, at GCLS, I expect that most of our audience is queer. And yes, Latina has been gaining popularity as an alternative. Either way, I mean, it's taking away that gendered ending. What I would recommend in all cases when you're dealing with somebody else's culture is to follow their lead. So, if you're in a conversation, especially email conversation or something like that with someone who's Hispanic, and they use the term Latinx, then feel free to do so. If you use that term and someone who is Hispanic requests that you not use it, please respect that in conversation with them. You're going to find folks who want you to use it, and folks who don't want you to use it. So I would tailor your use of it to your particular conversation. Great question, Renee. Thank you. Does that mean, so this is about the writing skin tone. Does that mean you're not allowed to describe someone's skin as olive skinned? Okay, so when you say olive skinned, right, you're not actually saying the person's skin resembles an olive, because as we know, there are no olives that are those skin, that is that skin color. I would avoid it just because I find that there are words that would be more useful and more precise. So when you say olive skin, it also kind of implies a nationality. You tend to, if you would call me tan, but if I came from the Mediterranean, you might say olive skin. So it tends to be misused often. So I would avoid it for the reason of it being inaccurate in many cases. So yeah. What do you say? So a question about folks being paid for being sensitivity readers. If someone requests payment for reading your manuscript, then, and you're not comfortable with paying them, then thank them for their time and find somebody else. But it is very common, especially if you seek out sources online for sensitivity readers. If it's not someone you know, it is extremely common to pay a sensitivity reader. Also keep in mind that emotional labor is involved and all labor should be compensated. If, you know, it is perfectly okay for someone to ask to be paid for their emotional labor. If that's not something you're capable of doing, then you just have to find a different source. Can you clarify the URL for writing with color? Let me go back and copy from here. 1 second, and I'm going to actually put the URL into the chat so you can have that. Okay, I dropped the URL for writing with color into the chat. Does GCLS still have a resource of folks who are willing to be sensitivity readers? We do not have that on the website, as far as I'm aware. At least when I was on the board, it was not available. What we found was that it was a difficult a database to navigate. So I know that while I was on the board, there were looking for ways to come up with a more navigable source for that. I would say in the meantime, using Writing Diversely would be a good opportunity. And then I just got okay. All right, so, and I think there were some questions in the chat. The chat's a little harder for me to navigate. So let me just, about dialogue, if all our characters of color always speak perfect English, isn't that a form of whitewashing? I can understand having them not all speak that way. It wouldn't make sense for everyone. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind is if you're saying having everyone speak perfect English is a form of whitewashing, that's implying that that only white people speak perfect English. So just think about why you're thinking of it that way. And no, it's not. There are folks who have a different whose English is not their first language, who speak perfect English. Also, I would recommend not writing accent into your dialogue. It makes it very difficult to read. No, I don't think that it's always, and also I'm not saying that you can't have characters of color who don't speak perfect English. I'm saying that think about like Huckleberry Finn, right? We all can remember or Tom Sawyer, both of them actually, the way that you read the dialogue in that, right? The way that you read the white characters speaking versus the black characters speaking, that's horribly racist. There's no other way to put that really. So yeah, like that's one of the things I'm talking about with confronting unconscious bias, is that the assumption that white people speak perfect English and people who are not white don't speak perfect English is something that we have to kind of confront in our own thought process. Let me just double check and make sure. Are there any other questions in the Q&A? For asking to interview someone, is there a typical approach regarding payment, treating to dinner, et cetera? I think that would come down to your relationship with folks. I would let them take the lead, offer them, is there something that, I can, generally a lot of interviews take place over a cup of coffee, right? It's a good place to meet common ground. I think that it might be a little odd to buy someone dinner or something like that, because it could then feel somewhat less professional, I guess, is the way I would treat it, like you would a professional interview. So yeah, in the past, I have either gone to folks' houses and either bring them a small gift, or like if it's a friend, you wouldn't necessarily have to do that. I think that, like I said, it depends on the relationship and yeah, it depends on the relationship is the bottom line. How do you find a balance between being historically, socially accurate to a time period and being diversely sensitive when writing a historical fiction book? That does make sense, Jessica. Thank you for the question. That is a concern, right? I have a friend who was working on doing a Western. And one of the things we talked about is like, you want to use accurate tribal names for Native or Indigenous characters in those books, but at the same time, those words are not accurate or correct, or in many cases kind. Like I talked about, there's some exonyms that are just not great. It's a fine line to run. I think that there is a good consensus that using a slur, even if it would be appropriate for the time, is not appropriate to do. It's 2022, right? We don't need to ever see the N-word in another book again. What you can do is be a little creative about how you do it. There was a book I read, I can't remember which one it was, but the discussion, it was basically like in the conversation, they kind of switched and had the main character basically explain that the person used a racial slur, and that while nobody thought twice about it at the time, like it can make your character feel uncomfortable. Keep in mind that when racial slurs were actively used in everyday conversation, there were still people who were uncomfortable with it. There's been the fight for racial equality has existed since the beginning of oppression, right? That it's not that every single person in antebellum America would use racial slurs. I would say that if your main character is intended to be heroic, then they should be one of those people who don't use racial slurs. Even in a different time, you can avoid that. And I would recommend doing so. But using inaccurate tribal names, I think, is a little bit more difficult. I would love, for that to be an ongoing conversation in our organization and in society is how do we not ignore racism from the past, but not perpetuate it. So that's an ongoing issue. How do you ensure a sensitivity reader how do you ensure with a sensitivity reader you're not just getting their experience? So it's similar to with an interviewee that you're, if you only have that one source, then you're only getting one point of view. You can't really. That's going to be part of the problem, is that you will always have, you can't write the entire breadth of what it is to be an individual. You can do your best to be authentic. So you can absolutely have a sensitivity reader who misses something, or a sensitivity reader who, if you'd left something in, wouldn't be bothered by it. Case in point, I use the word queer a lot. I mean, I did during this presentation. There are definitely people in the LGBTQ community who are not okay with that word and would definitely have an issue with it being used in a manuscript. And there are others who wouldn't. So you will get a little bit of bias of that one person's opinion. The idea, though, is that the most blatant things you're going to catch. And I should say that, we're all aware that there is ongoing conversation about whether it's appropriate to write outside your sphere at all. You're not going to please everyone. There are going to be folks who are going to be upset at what you do. and what you don't do. You just have to make sure you're doing as much work to ride the line of being authentic and respectful, and hope that you get it as right as you possibly can. We're all human, right? So we can't get it perfect. Let's see what else we got here. What would you do if your diverse characters mean you're killing off your people of color or gay or disabled, or the villains are one of those as well? Sensitivity readers are usually from multi-minorities. That's absolutely true. Most of us, have multiple areas of, like, for instance, I'm a lesbian, I'm neurodivergent. There's a lot of things that, we all have going on in our lives. But I would say that, as back to the part about killing off your people of color, gay or disabled, that is, as long as you are not, if you've got a story, right, with 6 folks who are all in danger of being killed, and the only one who dies is the gay person, I would say you buried your gays. If the only person who dies is your only Black character, that would be a problem. I would say that if you're in a situation where multiple people are going to die during the course of your stories, as long as all of those folks are from different communities, then you tend to be okay. I would definitely not only kill off one queer person in the story. If you've got multiple queer people, then you're okay. And it's okay if your villains are from a minority group. Okay. What we're talking about is writing authentic folks, not writing perfect folks. You can have a villain who is, neurodivergent. You can have a character, a villain who is BIPOC. The problem comes in when they are the villain because of that, right? That not that, this one person happens to be the villain. It is that the idea that that they are intrinsically bad because they are other. That's what you're trying to avoid. But you don't have to write every one of your marginalized characters don't have to be perfect. We're all flawed. That's the beauty of humanity, right? Is our flaws make us beautiful. And they make us real. It's more authentic to have a flaw in a character. I would say that's okay. Just be thoughtful about it, and ask yourself, why is it this person who is the villain? Why is it this person who's dying? If you don't have a good reason for it, or if you have to argue it, then it probably didn't come about organically. If it comes about organically, then you're probably okay. I hope that helped. I don't know if that helped. Let's see what else we got here. Hi, Kath. Thank you for saying this has been helpful. Okay, so this is just a former editor of mine being wonderful and sweet, and saying how many times I helped her during our editing process, and I would just say that she helped me a ton of times. So you're wonderful. Thank you, Kath. Okay, so that's everything I've got in the Q&A right now. Let me just, the chat is really hard to navigate. So if you have questions, throw them in the Q&A for me if I haven't gotten them. All right. Okay, so question. If I have people of color in my real life, is it okay for me to write characters of their ethnicity as I know them in my own real life? Okay, so it certainly is, but keep in mind that knowing a person of color is not necessarily knowing their experience, right? So like, being friends with someone, you don't always get everything of their experience. And that's why if you're going to write, anytime you write a character, you're close, right? You're, especially if they're, if they're a point of view character, either first person or third person close, you need to know how they interact with the world. And you don't necessarily get that from being, just being friends with someone. And I would say that doing an interview with someone gives them a chance to be more honest with you. A lot of times, one of the kind of taxes, right, of being a person of color, of being a queer person too, is adjusting how we act around other people, and code switching. That's the word. Sorry, I couldn't come up with the word. So it's called code switching. Basically, it is the way that you interact differently with someone who is within your group versus how you would react with someone who is outside your group. So as queer people, like, I'll give an example of like, when we're at GCLS, or you go to a gay bar, or you're with a group of friends who are all gay, the way you interact with those people are very different with the way you interact with like your straight neighbors, right? Or your straight friends that you go out with after work or something like that. So keep in mind that what you are getting, oftentimes, especially if you're white and you're talking about people of color, what you're getting is not necessarily an authentic depiction of their life. I talk about it like wearing a mask. When I came out, like my family was like, oh, we miss when you were just, normal and not like now everything's about being gay. And I'm like, well, what you miss is the mask I wore for my safety. So keep in mind that knowing a person doesn't necessarily mean you're seeing them without their mask on. I would say that it would be a good idea to still go through the steps, right? Just still go through researching the community, still go through interviewing, because if you are actively asking them about what it's like to live their life, that gives them permission to take the mask off. And you may not like what you get from them. You may find out that those folks don't necessarily feel as safe around to be themselves around you as you thought they did. And that is not necessarily because they don't trust you. It's because they have been hurt in the past. Think about how many times you thought it was cool to hold your partner's hand walking down the street and somebody shouts at you. People react to that. And so you next time you walk down that street, you may not hold their hand. So I would say that just knowing someone who lives outside of your sphere doesn't mean you know what it's like for them. That's the answer to that. And someone did mention that they've seen folks on the hub talking about sensitivity readers. And I haven't necessarily seen that on the hub. So I would say if that's on there, that's great. Go out and seek it out. I think that the hub is a really fantastic place where we can feel a little safer and a little more as a community as we look for stuff like this. So yeah, absolutely. Great. Do you feel we should never write from first person point of view of someone different from us? Not necessarily. Let me finish reading the whole question because it's a long question. Isn't it our job as fiction writers to imagine ourselves into the lives of people who are not us? If we only write our own experience, it seems to be more memoir than fiction. I do not think that you can never write. Obviously, I think you should write diverse characters, right? I don't think you should write from your own experience only. What I'm saying is that I think that it is harder to ride that line of not writing about being that person. For instance, I do not ever want to read another straight person writing about coming out. I just don't. You don't know what it's like. And so don't write that. That's my story to tell. Other people feel differently, and that is completely fine. There are some fantastic folks who write great stories who happen to be straight. It's not their fault. So I would recommend being careful about what is your story to tell. And I would say being thoughtful is great. That's exactly what you should do. Yeah. So I'm not saying no. I don't really like first person point of view, if I'm honest. Don't tell EJ Noyce. We have this argument sometimes. But if you only write in first person, if that's your comfort zone, and you want to write a diverse character, put in the work and do it. All right. Okay, so in a fantasy storyline, is it bad to avoid the person's otherness? For example, in the show Once Upon a Time, the evil queen was Latinx, but they didn't acknowledge it at all. I think it depends on the way you do it, right? To be honest, I watched Once Upon a Time and I did not realize that the actress was Latinx. And, you know, that is I feel like that's kind of problematic. I do not think that I don't think you should avoid their otherness because, again, our otherness is what makes us us. You can't tell my story without involving the fact that I am a lesbian. That is an integral part of how I access the world, of how I interact with the world. I think that it can be an issue to avoid otherness. Now, when you're talking about fantasy, however, you have to keep in mind that depending on what type of fantasy you're writing, you have created that otherness. So to put it there and then not acknowledge it seems odd. Now, in the case of Once Upon a Time, that's like near fiction. It's not, or near fantasy. It's not high fantasy, right? It's a near world experience. So these are folks who were like living in the U.S. in Maine of all places. So it would have actually been more appropriate to have the evil queen's ethnicity become part of it, especially because that show, as I recall, did not have a lot of diversity. So it kind of depends. I would say celebrating someone's identity is never a bad thing. Just the way you celebrate it is what's important. Okay. Is it acceptable to use stereotypical characters to preserve historical accuracy in a novel? I'm currently writing a novel that deals with the topic of slavery. Obviously, this can be a very triggering topic, and the story is heavy with stereotypical behaviors and vernaculars at various times throughout the story. I feel that it's critical for historical accuracy, but I'm dragging my feet finishing the novel because I'm afraid it will offend someone. So as I read this question, the thing that kind of pops out to me is that you feel the need to use stereotypical characters to preserve historical accuracy. And stereotypes were created to keep people down, right? So they're not accurate. By nature, stereotypes are not accurate. The way that, in the case of slavery, right, the way that we created certain stereotypes, a lot of those stereotypes, the mammy character, like all of that kind of ties back to white supremacy, right? Right, creating slavery and making slavery positive, trying to put a positive spin on it by saying like, oh, the Mamie character, I loved her. Like, that's why it's okay that I enslaved her. It just kind of, but, so I would recommend being thoughtful about that. I think that subverting stereotypes is always a better idea than writing them. And I think anytime as a white writer, when you write about slavery, it is a very difficult place to write something that won't hurt someone. And that's not your fault as an author, and that sucks. But the sins of the father, right? We kind of have to live in that world where there are good straight people out there, but the fact that bad straight people have hurt us in the LGBTQ community for so long means that we kind of get to say no sometimes. So I think if it were me, I would avoid slavery as a topic as a white writer, personally. What I would recommend if you want to go forward with the story, I would say that the stereotypical characters are not necessary to preserve historical accuracy, because that's exactly what those stereotypes were trying to do, was to dehumanize enslaved people. So I would recommend not being a part of that. I hope that's helpful. All right. And that is all the questions in the Q&A right now. I'll give y'all, if you have any more questions, we have a couple more minutes. And then otherwise, I feel like I've taken up a lot of y'all's time, but I'm so excited how interactive that we've been, how many questions you're asking. These are great. As Lynn said before, being here means you are being thoughtful. And that makes me very happy. I think that we need more of that in our community and in the world at large. So thank you so much for being here and for being thoughtful and for wanting to confront your biases, for wanting to grow, and for wanting to do it right. I think that's extremely important. And thank you all. And I don't have anything else in the Q&A, so I'm gonna say we're good here.
Thank you so much, Tagan, for an amazing educational experience. It was just amazing. And thank you everyone for being here with us today. We appreciate your support. We hope to see you at a future virtual series event. And we wish you a happy, great rest of your weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Take care.